My name is Andris Piebalgs and welcome to FSR Policy Debate. Today we have very, very special subject, and this is, I think, is the most challenging year for the European Commission. There will be many legislation anticipated, and we are looking on particular legislation. It is legislation on methane emissions. What should or what should not be in it? The beauty and the challenge at the same time, it is a new legislation. So that means that it should be a robust one, but it's also the legislation that you can't change so easily as it usually is with EU legislation. It takes years later to change it, if at all. There have been a lot of debate, and Commission has been very helpful in publishing many questions on consultation on the legislative proposal. It's true also from these proposals, well, consultation papers that Commission made, it's not so clear what actually Commission has in mind. And that's why I think it's also beauty to discuss today, because there have been a lot of discussion between NGOs and also in industry groups. And I have today excellent speakers, very knowledgeable speakers that I will introduce before giving them the floor. And I have privilege that Malcolm McDowell from European Commission agreed to make conclusions. I would like now to invite Christopher to make opening remarks, really to introduce the subjects that we are discussing today and what are the stakes of it. Christopher.
Thank you, Andris, and thank you to the folks who've agreed to join us today. So the issue of methane emissions is really important. It feels technical when one first starts to delve into the subject, but one realizes rather quickly that it's actually really rather important. And it's important for the whole vertical chain of the industry. It's important for producers. It's important for wholesalers, it's important for consumers, and it's very important for civil society as a whole. I mean, it's important for consumers and civil society because it's fundamentally important that the whole chain of GHGs in the energy that we consume is accounted for. And at the moment, methane is imperfectly or not accounted for at all. Secondly, we're not entirely sure as yet the precise levels of fugitive methane or methane that is incorporated, in particular, I was going to say gas, but not just gas, coal, the whole value chain here. And one reads wide variations of the amount of methane that is emitted during the production and transport process. And obviously, given the GHG characteristics of methane, it's really important that it is properly accounted for and valued. And I'd say also, it's extremely important for producers of natural gas, not least because if we fail to get a real control and handle over this and properly account for methane emissions, then I can see down the line that there are calls for a gas phase-out date, in the same as we have a coal phase-out date, which is politically rather than economically justified. And so there are interests in resolving these issues correctly for all parties to this debate. And obviously there are two key areas that we're going to be discussing today. One is the MRV, monitoring, reporting and verification, which is one side, okay? And then the other side is the question, okay, once we've monitored, reported and verified, how we are going to account for the methane emissions. In terms of the MRV, there's same as taking account of them. There's two issues, and one is internal the EU, one is external the EU. Internal the EU, it's relatively easy. This is relatively easy to do. One can simply impose on EU companies along the value chain the obligation to fully account for undertake MRV to the necessary standard, OMGP 2.0 or equivalent. For external producers, extraterritoriality is an issue, but it's terribly important that this is resolved. So we look forward to the debate on this issue very much. The second issue, of course, is what to do with the MRV reporting once we've achieved it. And in that respect, the key issue, again, is how do we ensure that once we've monitored, verified, and reported these emissions, how do we ensure that they're fully incorporated into greenhouse gas reporting and accounting and cost methodologies in the European Union? And there's various methods you can do that. Methane is a gas, a GHG gas, that falls within the scope of the ETS. So logically, once we have MRV, then people will be able to report the methane within the ETS emissions. There is also a discussion of using some form of border tax, parallel to, but not included. It's not exactly the same thing as the CBAM. So these are very difficult issues. And of course, it's almost impossible to achieve the appropriate valuing, if you like, how you value, how you properly account and incorporate into the costing element of carbon within the EU until you've got the MRV done correctly. And so it's vitally important to do all of these three things at the same time. So Andries, on that I will pass back to you because the key issue is the speakers today.
Yeah, it's sure. So, and that's why I would invite now Dr. Stefan Schwartz to reflect on MRV frameworks. Stefan works for Environmental Defense Fund. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andries. Thanks for the opportunity to speak here today, and good afternoon, everybody. Most people in the audience, I'm trying to move my slide, hope they will. No, they do. Most people in the audience here are probably familiar with the term MRV, or monitoring, reporting, and verification, from tracking a variety of environmental issues. When it comes to methane, MRV is especially important for making progress with mitigation that is both substantive and credible. In fact, MRV is the foundation for effective emission regulation and mitigation. Tracking methane well has been a challenge in the past, but there is immense development to enable robust tracking in the near future. This development needs to be integrated in methane MRV. I will try here to outline briefly the key features of what an effective MRV system should look like. And this slide here summarizes the main points, and then I'll dive a bit deeper into each one. It is essential to integrate methane measurements. Having done measurements around the world, it is clear that desktop analyses alone are insufficient for understanding methane emissions and for identifying effective mitigation options. Top-down and bottom-up measurements complement each other and should both be used. An MRV system must mature along with new measurement technologies and methods, and so these need to be accommodated. Transparency and granularity of data are key for ensuring trust and a common understanding of managing the emissions. Standardization will help make different data collection approaches comparable, and validation verification by qualified personnel is important for checks and balances. And then finally, the results of an MRV system could also be used to update national inventory reports that are submitted under UNFCCC. So let's look a little closer at monitoring. The basis of any sensible data collection, whether this is tracking the frequency of venting events or conducting atmospheric measurements, is a sensible sampling plan. The value of the collected data ultimately depends not only on how well you track and measure, but what you track and measure. So operators should design their monitoring such that statistically representative samples are being produced. And this design should be comprehensible to the data users. And we'll get to that under verification. Specifically, the sampling should account for variability in emissions over time and across facilities and facility types. Super emitters account for relatively few sources, but for an important share of total emissions, and they're also a major mitigation opportunity. So sample sizes should be large enough to identify them. The most insights are gathered from measurements when bottom-up and top-down measurements are combined and reconciled, and then compared with emission factors and engineering calculations. And I'll explore this a bit more in the next slide. So source level measurements are shown on the left. Here the examples are optical gas imaging on top and then high flow sampling below. Those are important to detect and prioritize specific mitigation actions. The downsides are that OGI can miss sources, and the quantification part mostly focuses on leaks and not on intended emissions like vents and incomplete combustion. And so based on experience, especially the largest emission sources are either unsafe to measure on site, so to quantify on site, or difficult to access. Facility level measurements, either via mobile ground setups or using drones or aircraft, or continuous network sensors, which are not shown here. Those aim at quantifying total emissions from a facility. The results aren't necessarily perfect for every single facility that you measure, but the value is in combining the site and source level data across all facilities to achieve reconciliation and cross-validation. And this can be an iterative process, and this process itself is really key to understand the emissions and then potentially redesign operations. In terms of reporting, a blueprint for the reporting part of MRV is fairly well covered under OGMP 2.0. The details of OGMP 2.0 will be the result of a multi-stakeholder engagement. And it applies to all oil and gas assets along the natural gas supply chain. That's upstream, exploration and production, gathering and processing, gas transmission, liquefaction and regasification terminals, underground gas storage and distribution. It applies to all sources of methane emissions, including fugitives, venting, incomplete combustion, and that at operated and non-operated facilities. There are 5 levels of data reporting with increasing levels of granularity and quality. And the gold standard, it requires site level measurements, which will validate the reported emissions based on the source level measurements. And OGMP member companies have already committed to have this technology ready to measure at the site level in about 3 years. These measurements will cover their operated and non-operated facilities, which already account for about 1/3 of global total oil and gas production. Verification should be conducted by competent government entities, such as national ministries, regulators, and government agencies. And whether accredited independent third-party companies can support here should also be explored. It's clear from the discussion on monitoring and reporting that both include a fair degree of complexity. And as a result, transparency is absolutely crucial. Any meaningful verification only works if really granular information is made available to those who verify. Granularity means that the data on the source level measurements show not only the source level results, but also the sampling plan. The same applies to facility level measurements. Only then can authorities determine if bottom line conclusions are valid. It would also be valuable to make the granular data available to independent researchers to enable external verification and policy evaluation, and possibly under NDAs. The aggregated emissions data should be made available to the public to increase trust in the MRV process. The International Methane Emissions Observatory could play a role in this MRV system. OGMP 2.0 is one of the work streams of IMEO, and as such, it will analyze the reported data. Again, it will be crucial to have access to both the methods employed by each operator on top of the results. IMEO is also expected to cross-check with data from country reporting and local science studies and satellite data. The satellite data will partly be at a higher level of aggregation, including more than one operator, but it allows to at least do consistency checks on the reported data. Tropomi is already being used to quantify methane emissions from different regions, and MethaneSat will soon contribute more public methane data to fill a critical gap that currently exists between the global mapping instruments like Tropomi and commercial point source trackers. So I will leave it here, and we'll try to answer any questions now. If possible, later via email.
I have not got any question from the audience at this stage, but I invite to write. But I have a Stefan question, basically stemming from the information that Bruce Chisholm put in a chat. Basically, what's the point of whatever MRV if it gives the results that are not credible? Now the estimation, 8-year estimation says, well, they have been twice as much actually emissions. If I would, with my tax authorities, do the same, so that I will just have reported half of my incomes, I think I would end up in prison. So why it is such a problem, and how to avoid not having such a type of situations that basically you could always question officially certified data? I think that is one question. And the second is very much related to it. How to establish credibility on everybody who use MRV systems. EU starts use one, let's say US, China. Are there things that should be similar, or it is really how you implement the system?
Yes, so I think as I mentioned, the reporting part, it's really key for that to report not just results, and as you say, you can report your financial activity the way you want it, but you also there should be a part where you report also how you've done that, what methods have you used to get there, and describe that at a level of granularity where it is quite difficult to, well, for lack of a better word, to cheat. It should be quite clear what has been measured, what in other cases, for example, emission factors have been used. Are the samples representative? I think that's quite key. And this is also a part where then in the verification, whether it's an auditor or whether it's a national government entity, can really look through those reports and check for all these items. So in the end, it is not just the results that count, it's all the methods that go into it that need to be reported. Andres, I think you're muted.
Sorry, I wanted to ask, on EU level, how detailed this MRV legislation should be? It should be very prescriptive, saying, well, you need to do this, check, or it is more on general principles and still to leave to, well, some discretion to national authorities or to individual companies even. So how detailed, in your opinion, it should be on European level?
I think this is something that we'll have to develop a bit over time. So OGMP 2.0, it gives a blueprint already on what should be reported, and sort of a next step is sort of how exactly that should be done. And there are details like how do you make sure that you're representative in what you report in terms of your spatial variability that you have as an operator, and also temporal variability. There are intermittent emissions, for example. These are details that may not be completely figured out at this point, but where in the end an operator will, I think there will be the responsibility on an operator to basically show that representative is covered. And this might be different from operator to operator. For example, if you have an offshore operator, maybe intermittency, it means something very different to an onshore operator. So this is something that we'll have to develop over time, I believe.
Thank you very much. Now we were moving to legislation on leakage detection and repair. The floor is now to Tania Meixius Fernandez from Enagas. Tania, the floor is yours.
Hello. So can you see my screen now?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in these sessions. I'm Tania and I work for Enagas, which is the main gas infrastructure operator in Spain. And I'm also chairing the Methane Emissions group in Gas Infrastructure Europe, and also deeply involved in other European and international organizations and initiatives as Gas and the Methane Guiding Principles. So I have focused my presentation on ELDAR, as Andres said, because on one hand, I have been involved in the development of the technical recommendation on ELDAR programs in Gas, and in addition on the policy brief on ELDAR in the Methane Guiding Principles. So last year, when the Commission published the strategy so the strategy, I don't know how I can remove the upper part of this, but I hope that you can see the screen. So last year, when the Commission published the strategy to reduce the methane emissions in the European Union, so they already announced that they will deliver legislative proposals in 2021 for the energy sector, and in particular obligations to improve the ELDAR programs along the gas value chain. So in the industry, so among GIE, Gas, IPCA, and IOGP, so we have been working on a glossary on methane emissions, which has been published some weeks ago, and you can find it available in this link. So we have been working on these definitions covering the complete gas value chain. And so this glossary includes a definition for leaks, which are unintentional emissions from pressurized equipment used in the oil and gas industry. And also, so the ELDAR programs are used to identify and support the repair of these leaks. So ELDAR programs are not new for the industry. They have been carried out from the beginning, mainly at the beginning from safety reasons, and nowadays we have reduced the thresholds, and we are focusing on doing them also for environmental purposes. And so then in the Methane Guiding Principles, so to develop the policy brief, so we have been looking to the existing legislation in other jurisdictions. So there is legislation in Canada, the States, Mexico, Norway, Russia, covering ELDAR, but mainly for the upstream assets. We were also looking to two very important publications. On one hand, the International Energy Agency published at the beginning of this year the regulatory roadmap and toolkit, which contains very useful and interesting information on this, and also to the policy briefs of the Florence School of Regulation, in particular the one on lessons learned for the European Union based on the legislation in North America. We have learned that there is also legislation in some EU member states covering ELDAR, but mainly for DSOs. And so in addition to the legislation, so we have been also looking to guidance and different practices and documents that have been developed by the industry or in collaboration with the industry. So for example, the best practice guides of the Methane Guiding Principles, which are available on the NGP's website, and also the TGDs, the technical guidance documents of OEMP on fictive components and equipment leaks. And so there were also additional documents and publications that we were looking, and also some standards that are very frequently used by the industry. And so in addition, on the methane and downstream, and referring to with this methane downstream to transmission, underground gas storages, distribution grids, and LNG regasification terminals. So GIA Marcogas developed or prepared a questionnaire on LDAR programs, and we were gathering information from companies on the policies, regulation, and standards that they are in their countries. Also to the technical aspects of the LDAR programs that they were implementing. So the thresholds that they were setting, or the frequencies, the instruments that they were using. Also on the cost and cost recovery. So in the mid and downstream segments, there are mainly regulated companies, and so the costs related to the LDAR programs were not, or are not always included in the allowed revenues by the NRAs. And so we asked them also the challenges that they were facing to implement the ambitious LDAR programs. And so based on that, so we developed this for mid and downstream, the technical recommendation on LDAR, and in the NGPs, so the policy brief. What we have seen is that so the LDAR programs are not harmonized along the gas value chain. So depending on the asset, the specificities, the age, so the environmental aspects or safety aspects, so or also the history of the company. So the LDAR programs that they are performing nowadays are different. But the basis for the LDAR programs are similar. So the companies are defining the leak detection, so the technologies that they will be using on site. So also whether they will perform some quantification or not, because so in some cases the LDAR programs are a good opportunity to also do some quantification. Then companies go on site with the technologies and instruments. They detect the leaks, so all the information is included in the internal inventories of the companies. And so sometimes it's possible to do the repairs in parallel during the LDAR program. And in other cases, so the leaks are classified, and normally they are repaired in 1 year, so they were detected. And so based on, so all the information is included in the inventory, and then an analysis is performed on how the next LDAR programs can be improved. And so this is doing on frequent basis. And so in addition to the definitions that we have included in the NGP's documents, and also in the glossary of that I have mentioned, so we have developed some recommendations in the NGPs. So first of all, so we want to ensure that flexibility is given to the industry, that not the same requirements are implemented along the complete gas value chain. So the recognition that one solution doesn't fit all the assets or all the equipments. Also, the use of multiple technologies will contribute to achieve an optimal outcome of detection of emissions. Also, the recognition that the technologies and the methodologies are evolving very quickly. And so we have seen that in some jurisdictions, the technology that should be used is included. But what we have seen here is that so the companies are using in some cases gas detectors or infrared cameras, or drones with infrared cameras, airborne with lasers installed, or handheld devices as lasers or ultrasonic devices, or the infrared or the optical gas imaging cameras. And so in addition to these technologies that are used nowadays, so this is evolving very, very quickly. So therefore this flexibility should be ensured. And also to ensure that the industry is setting up a robust LDAR program. So it's important to ensure that technical recommendations or LDAR protocols, or how information on how to train the person, the people carrying out the LDAR programs, information on how the repair procedures or on the technologies that can be used. So all this should be available to ensure that the industry is setting up robust LDAR programs. And so it's true that we are asking for flexibility, but it's also important to demonstrate that we are reducing the emissions. So the aim of the LDAR programs is to find and fix these emissions, but it's important to show that we are doing it. And so the technical guidance documents that are at the moment under development in OGMP, so I think that they will contribute to this. Also, the reporting of the industry to OGMP and to the IMEO will show how this can be quantified and how these LDAR programs, how effective they are. And the last recommendation is that for the regulated operators, so this is also recognized in the strategy that was published by the Commission last year, that the costs associated to LDAR should be recognized by NRAs, and also the recovery should be allowed. And so that was all from my side. So happy to answer any question.
Well, Tanya, it will be me asking. I have the audience need to warm up a bit. I think in each legislation there is always this challenge between flexibility given and demands. Well, EPA, for example, says if you do LDAR campaign once a year, then you save 40% of emission. If you do each month, 80%. So from the persons that are not involved in it directly, it seems huge improvement. Well, let's the companies do each month it. Where is the, well, what are criteria to design flexible but still efficient LDAR campaign?
Mm-hmm. So we have seen that, for example, in the methane downstream, so the most common frequency is the annual LDAR programs. So normally the companies are going once per year to their main assets to do this LDAR. In the upstream, so in some cases, so this frequency is lower. So I think that depending on the asset, so there will be different frequencies. So it's not the same to go to a production site or to an LNG terminal, which is very located to the transmission or distribution grid that is thousands and thousands of kilometers and small assets along the countries. So therefore, based on in the NGP, so we didn't try to have a recommendation on the frequency, but in Marcogas, so we were also looking to as I said, to the different frequencies in mid and downstream, and normally 1 year is the most frequent, but it depends a lot on the companies.
And perhaps one for somebody who is still trying to understand the subject better. Is there a link between MRV framework and LDAR? So does, for example, LDAR campaign helps MRV or MRV framework help better target LDAR campaigns?
Mm-hmm. So normally LDAR is only find and fix the leaks, but it's true so that these LDAR programs are a good opportunity to quantify the methane emissions, and it's a normal practice that the companies are doing this quantification or this measurement of the emissions in a representative sample of the assets and their components. And so based on the results of this quantification, so the output of this quantification, so it will be used to have a specific emission factors and to have this reporting of the emissions.
Thank you, Tanya. Now we move to the performance and production standards. It is rather interesting subject also of Florence School of Regulation has a couple of papers written on this, but as expert on it is Miriam Hamani from Shell, and Miriam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andres. Hello, everyone. I'm Miriam Hamami, and I work on carbon policy in Shell. Very pleased to be here today to talk about the upcoming EU methane legislation and also how to make sure that the legislative proposals reflect the upper end of the EU methane strategy. So the EU methane strategy emphasizes that the EU, as the world's largest importer of fossil fuels, has both the responsibility and the capacity to promote the reduction of global energy-related methane emissions. As shared by Stefan and Tanya, MRV and LDAR and also requirements on venting and flaring are very important elements to include in the upcoming legislation, because we have to improve data, and we must do so while continuing to reduce emissions. However, in the longer term, prescriptive technical regulation may not meet the challenge of the moment. Alone, MRV, LDAR, and also venting and flaring requirements may not take into consideration the performance outcomes and the level of success achieved through the techniques deployed. Prescriptive policies around LDAR and venting and flaring cannot be imposed outside of the EU's borders, leaving most of the gas sold in the EU, which originates mostly from imports, outside of the legislation scope. The EU therefore has an extremely important opportunity to set objectives and benchmarks for both domestic and import gas supply chains in its new methane policies and regulations. Prescriptive mitigation requirements alone may not take into consideration, as I mentioned, the performance outcomes, and therefore they need to be complemented in the longer term with performance-based policies. Next slide, please, Chiara. So we believe that starting off with developing a robust MRV framework while implementing the prescriptive policies, then applying more flexible performance-based policies over time as a second step, and also once the MRV framework is in place, is the most effective policy design approach for the EU. And the IEA also discusses this approach in the in the methane regulatory roadmap. An EU methane performance standard and the procurement standard that apply to all gas sold in the EU should be at the heart of these performance-based policies. Under the performance standard, gas is produced at a methane intensity of less than 0.20%, which is a benchmark established by industry through voluntary initiatives. The procurement standard then will aim to procure gas that meets that performance standard into the EU. In terms of how to achieve the procurement standard and how to get that low methane intensity gas into the EU, we believe that establishing equivalence between the EU and gas exporting countries is potentially the most effective way to deliver these performance-based policies, given the partner countries' direct role in regulating methane and overseeing MRV that meets an EU standard. Regulatory equivalence between the EU and gas exporting countries keeps regulations within domestic jurisdictions, leverages energy policy efforts, energy diplomacy efforts, and also incentivizes policy-driven climate action in those countries. In parallel with establishing regulatory equivalence with third countries, we also believe that a methane certification scheme that is based on reliable and transparent MRV needs to be designed and implemented on a voluntary basis. It may even become mandatory if regulatory equivalence efforts prove unsuccessful. Can we please move to the next slide, please, Chiara? And here I really wanted to include some voices that spoke about the methane performance standard in the last weeks and months. Be it within the financial community, IIGCC published a letter earlier this month calling for a mandatory performance standard in the EU that strives to achieve 0.20% methane intensity in upstream. The EU Commission in the strategy also talked about considering proposing legislation on targets, standards, and other incentives Our kind host today, the Florence School of Regulations, also published a brief where they talked about the methane emissions performance standard being a useful first step in the direction of achieving the European Green Deal objectives. And last but not least, Shell and 9 other companies and organizations last year shared some recommendations with the EU Commission calling for a performance standard and a procurement standard applying to the full supply chain and all gas sold in the EU. So in summary, what should be in the upcoming methane legislation in the EU? Definitely an MRV framework to make sure the data improves and becomes more robust and transparent. Prescriptive policies, because they're easier to administrate as a first step, and they will reduce emissions while the MRV framework is being developed. And then as a second step, a transition towards performance-based policies where a performance standard is set by the EU that has in scope all gas sold in the EU, so that includes domestic and imports. And then to achieve the methane performance standard from imports, we believe that establishing regulatory equivalence with third countries is the most effective way. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. If I may to ask a very simple question, because Simon Colley asked from audience, can the speaker please clarify the meaning of methane intensity of 0.2%? What does it mean?
Yeah, so I will refer here to the industry benchmark, for example, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative methane intensity target, which applies to the upstream segment, and for OGCI that stops at the point of sale after the LNG plant. For OGCI, for example, the methane intensity is defined as methane emissions from all oil and gas facilities up to that point as the numerator, and then the denominator is marketed gas. So it's gas sold into the gas supply chain. And that basically, that is the equation used for the 0.20%.
Yeah, and Insa Mareike Rega asks, would a procurement standard render a carbon border adjustment mechanism unnecessary?
So these are unrelated policies. So I think that methane and CO2 should not be mixed in a policy because they're short-lived gases and long-lived gases, and they have different impact on the climate. So when it comes to, for example, the CBAM or the carbon border adjustment, that is, I think, applicable to CO2 or carbon. We are talking here about methane emissions, and we propose a performance standard as the most effective policy to deliver that. So they're tackled as 2 separate things.
Yeah. The question from Ben Ratner, it's also related to 0.2. He asked, what steps are companies, because 0.2 comes from companies' initiative, like Shell are taking that give confidence that the performance standard can indeed be met by 2025, at least on company level?
Yeah, so there are, of course, Shell has its own methane intensity targets that applies also to all oil and gas assets in upstream and integrated gas. The target is also of 0.20%. So the steps, for example, we take involve the deployment of leak detection and repair, involves also new projects to have some design features to minimize flaring and venting. Also, we work on improving our data. We are a signatory of the OGMP 2.0 reporting framework. So we are taking many steps to reduce emissions and maintain the methane intensity of our assets within the 0.20%. And it's a journey, of course. We're not saying we've done everything we could have done, but we are working on it.
I see Christopher is impatient. Christopher.
No, yeah, thanks, Miriam. Obviously, any policy that the EU would implement would be aimed at being progressive in terms of trying to incentivize companies to progressively reduce methane emissions. So, obviously the 0,2 isn't intended to last forever. And also it doesn't result in, like in the ETS, carbon has a value. So do you have a view on how this would be the first step towards what?
So Christopher, you mean in terms of the value, the 0.20%?
Well, either the so either in terms of the 0,2, would that be progressively reduced, or would it eventually be replaced by some form of ETS-based methodology, for example?
So just back to the ETS point, I think that methane or short-lived gases and long-lived gases should not be mixed in policies. So I'm not sure here, and also because of the state of MRV, of course, of methane emissions, maybe ETS is not the best place for methane emissions to mitigate methane emissions. In terms of the continuous improvement, of course, the 0.2% at the end of the day is a near zero intensity. It's the ambition is, of course, to continuously reduce methane emissions, and 0.20% is an ambitious benchmark. And as the data improves over time, of course, I think there is a benefit in looking at what the intensity becomes and whether the emissions are higher or lower as a result of the improved MRV methodology. So I think that continuous improvement process and the continuous collaboration between the different stakeholders here is very much key to keeping those policies ambitious and also, of course, implementable, because at the end of the day, it has to be implemented by industry, and it has to deliver also the EU's contributions from methane emissions to the Green Deal objectives.
And so last question. So the 0,2 by 2025, is this period long enough to enable producers to take the necessary steps to ensure that they meet this target?
I believe it's worth a shot. I think that if MRV is developed, say, within the next couple of years, and if we start now looking into the performance standard, because this is a very key consideration. Of course, you cannot implement a performance standard if the MRV is not robust enough. But what you can do is you can start thinking about it and designing it and capturing the learnings from now so that it can be implemented by 2025.
Thank you, Miriam. I have two questions to Stefan, if it's possible. Stefan, there are two questions that are from audience. One is from Manuel Vicencio, who asks about scope 3 emissions, because MRV, OGMP 2.0, it's scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. What about scope 3? Should it be included or not? And the other one is a bit, I will be rephrased what Mauricio Cepeda asks. It is performance-based policies. What timeline you give for performance-based policies? Stefan.
So on the first one with scope 3, I'm assuming you're referring then to end use.
Yes, exactly. That is where the question is, should it be included or not? Because normally it ends up with energy use. So,
yeah, I don't think I can give you a definitive answer on this, but I would say scope 1 and 2 are probably complex enough at this point to do it right, and so one should probably start with that and then see if it can be expanded to end use.
And then the other issue is related is performance-based policies, because prescriptive, nobody likes prescriptive. Everybody hates it in a way, and everybody would like performance-based. Still, from regulator point of view, it's always prescriptive is made it easier. But if you go performance-based, what timelines could be looked upon? So you have a target for a year, for 5 years, or 10 years. I think that's where the question goes.
Yeah, well, I'm not an operator. I can't really answer this question so well, but the companies within OGMP, as I mentioned, they have committed already to involve facility level measurements actually within 3 years of the operated assets, and within, I believe, 5 years in non-operated assets. So this might be sort of a ballpark of how fast companies believe they can make this happen. And obviously that's a key part of an MRV system.
Thank you very much. Miriam, you still have questions that I did not ask you. Just look on the question in the chat, and also on the question and answers, that's part. And now we are moving to the area very much related for the others and still very specific. It is a biomethane. Biomethane is sometimes seen as a enormous perspective for supplying us with clean molecules, and at the same time, from society, in particular from NGOs, it's looked at a lot of suspicion, and not at least also this methane related. Nicholas Jensen from Eurogas is a real expert on it. And Nicholas, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andres. I hope you can hear me all right. I think your introduction is spot on in the sense that it's a topic that is wildly debated. It's very much supported in terms of biomethane being very important in the energy transition. And I think it's quite important to look as well in more general terms at how to decarbonize the agricultural sector and the waste sector. So maybe I can start with a little bit of context of, you mentioned suspicion in NGOs. I think a lot of people might wonder why Eurogas is presenting on the topic of biogas and biomethane in itself as a question. In Eurogas, we've been working on renewable and low carbon gas development for quite a while, and we also take methane emissions as a very important theme for us. We're signatories to the Methane Guiding Principles, as I think most of us on the panels are, if not all. And in that context is where the discussion particularly picked up speed on the biogas and biomethane side, and related to the agricultural and waste sector. So it's started a while ago now, of course, when the Commission published the methane strategy, where we were very happy to see that the agricultural and waste sector were being covered, and that they were being picked as one of the themes or one of the sectors that needed to be worked on more, or at least would have to be looked at in a bit more detail. So what we decided to do within the Methane Guiding Principles is to bring a group together and look at biogas and biomethane and agricultural emissions in general. And we managed to also get the help from the European Biogas Association, without their expertise, I think it would have been impossible to work in the topic in more detail. And basically, I'd like to share a few of the thoughts that came out during that discussion, and also for the audience's information. I'm happy to answer any questions, but it's very much a theme which is constantly evolving. So we're always happy to get additional input. The first thing to say is that the agricultural and the waste sectors are the biggest emitters of methane, let's say, whether it's specific, specific production within the agricultural sector or specific types of waste. It's a big item in terms of methane emissions, and very often it's something that's been disregarded because it at least is considered as a very hard to abate sector, or a sector where it's very hard to find solutions to reduce those emissions. Taking that, let's say, that consideration into account, we decided to look at one of the most direct solutions, which is biomethane and biogas production, and look a little bit at where this was being considered and where this was being tackled also overall in legislation. So looking at regulatory frameworks and where methane emissions related to agriculture and the way to process those emissions, i.e. biogas or biomethane, were being dealt with, we of course see some strong focus in texts such as the Renewable Energy Directive. So we have to consider as a starting point where those issues are being dealt with. So in terms of the Renewable Energy Directive, there's a lot of focus on renewable gas, namely biomethane, in reducing emissions. There is, let's say, the sector is covered also in the Industrial Emissions Directive and the Pollutants Register. The Commission did point to some potential solutions in the methane strategy and the consultation which followed, which have already been mentioned very briefly, also in terms of how to deal with methane by Christopher Jones when looking at the ETS and the ESR. So I think there's many different directions that could be taken to address agricultural emissions and waste. But the specific way we looked at it was really to say, how does biogas and biomethane production help reduce emissions in those sectors, and how could they be further incentivized? So how could those emissions be pushed down even further? The most important point, I think, that we have to remember when looking at biogas and biomethane production is the avoided emissions, because if we look at the overall production process, and of course, whether it's agricultural, whether we're looking at crops, or we're looking at livestock, there is, of course, a whole element of cycle and value chain in terms of how the emissions are produced or created throughout that process. Biomethane in itself will allow to recover emissions which would otherwise have been basically emitted. For instance, the crop that would otherwise be fermenting outside, or manure, instead of being allowed to directly emit CH4 in the natural digestion mechanism that happens in nature, instead it's recovered by being anaerobically digested. The process is I'm sure known to a lot of people on the panel. But namely, you would process waste inside an anaerobic digester, taking out the oxygen part, heating the overall mix, breaking it down through bacteria, thereby accelerating the natural process of fermentation, and you recover a gas, which is biogas. This biogas is a bit more than 50% of methane and then other types of gases. And in that form can be used either to produce electricity and heat, or it can be further purified, so removing the other gases, including oxygen and CO2, to bring it to 96+% CH4 and injecting it into the gas network to be consumed at the later stage. In that particular perspective, I think it's important to look at how the process itself allows to avoid emissions. So again, here in the overall cycle, you reduce emissions which would otherwise have been produced. It also has a wide range of advantages in terms of rural recovery, in terms of allowing for additional farmer income in let's say in value chains which might otherwise be difficult to re-incentivize. And it has a big aspect or a future potential in terms of energy system integration. So allowing the reduction of emissions, not only in the agricultural sector, but also in other production value chains, whether in buildings, in cities, in heating, and so on. So if we look at the simple equation related to biomethane production, of course, it seems like a very simple process where little emission, there is little emission risk or there is little to be improved. Of course, we recognize, and I think in the group and in the discussion, we recognize that in itself, biomethane is incredibly important to reduce emissions, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't take additional steps or make additional efforts to further reduce the emissions from those supply chains and those production processes. One of the ways to tackle this is, and we've set some recommendations and some focus on this, one of the ways is to deal with emissions from the tanks upstream of the digester. So when feedstock is being pulled together and manure, for example, making sure that it's adequately covered so that emissions aren't produced from that. It's also something that's dealt with in the Renewable Energy Directive for a later stage of the process by having digestates closed off from emitting and recovering as much methane as possible. Making sure that leakages at gas holders and gas holder fixation, which are a very specific part of the production process, as well as safety valves are being dealt with in terms of best available technologies, which can help reduce a lot the potential emissions of methane during the process. And then there's, of course, the emissions from the biogas units themselves. So as I mentioned, you can have two types of productions, biogas or purified biomethane. If the biogas is used directly for electricity and heat production, there can be, in case of malfunction of a process, there can be some small emission at the startup of the process, which can be avoided by combining the heat and power production in the overall approach. In terms of the recommendation, and I'll finish on that note, as I know I'm getting close to my time. Apologies for that. We came together in the group and agreed quite strongly, at least in terms of what should be the way ahead for this. In terms of reducing emissions from the sector, we think that in itself, incentivizing and supporting biomethane development is very important because it's a quick win, and it's kind of a way to kill two birds with one stone by reducing emissions that would otherwise be naturally emitted and recovering those to decarbonize certain end users. We also think that the overall sector integration perspective is very important in this, and we work very closely as well, particularly the European Biogas Association, with farmers and farmer association, making sure that they have all the tools and the information on financing available, including from the Common Agricultural Policy, to reduce their emissions and produce renewable energy. We believe that the positive externalities and benefits from biomethane production, as exemplified, as I've tried to share with you, in terms of the value chain and the different places where emissions can be reduced, should be adequately considered. Similarly, in the Renewable Energy Directive, we think that the revision should provide some clarity, particularly for small producers, about their reduction in CO2 equivalent, so including greenhouse gases, and the way that this is calculated, and them proving that their production is sustainable. We think that renewable gas, biomethane, and the feedstock use should respect the waste hierarchy. And here, of course, in terms of the waste that's used, biomethane is considered, or anaerobic digestion is considered as recycling in itself. And we think this is a very important and positive in the overall framework. And then the last point I'd like to share before handing back to you and to any questions, Andres, is that voluntary best practices should very much be supported. There are monitoring schemes and best practices developed. We discussed in our group work, particularly in advanced markets like Scandinavia or France. There are some very interesting initiatives in terms of voluntary schemes that could really help in being rolled out further around Europe. And I think at this stage, I'll leave it at that. I hope that wasn't too long, particularly without slides.
Well, no, Nicholas, always a pleasure seeing you, and it was terrific. But the question what I have not heard, perhaps I badly listened, is Biomethane, yes, it's methane, but it is so specifically, I would say, surrounded by so many issues that the question is, should not be just treated in the Renewable Energy Directive, and methane legislation, with due respect that it is still should somehow steer away from biomethane.
I guess that you listened very closely because you didn't hear me talk about it. So that's absolutely right, Andres. I think it's one of those topics where it's a little bit of both. What we discussed in the group is that we don't think that biomethane and biogas should be fundamentally excluded from methane legislation. We think that certain things which might be proposed in a future methane legislation, and here, of course, not preempting anything that Malcolm might say, but in case of focus on best practices and voluntary schemes, we think those are things that would be hugely relevant for biomethane and biogas. What we're worried about is if you look at different scales, so if you have very small producers, it might be overly burdensome for them to be able to, for example, report very granularly on their emissions and on any type of very specific performance-based standard. So I guess my answer would be a little bit of both. We wouldn't exclude it because, of course, we want to do better. But at the same time, we don't think that everything that might be relevant for the rest of the value chain might be relevant there. I would say it's still work in progress to get the detail.
I saw that Stefan raised his virtual hand. Stefan.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to give a sort of a quick perspective from the MRV side on biogas and biomethane. So in terms of the actual measuring methane emissions, let's say from a biogas plant, I think it makes it easier for biogas, biomethane, simply because there are fewer plants compared to the fossil oil and gas industry. In terms of sort of really bottom line conclusions of how well biogas and biomethane reduce methane emissions in the supply chain, I think here the key issue is really understanding the different pathways of what does biogas and biomethane replace, let's say on a farm, but also in terms of the end use. And here I just want to volunteer that my colleague Mark O'Mara, a scientist at EDF, will publish a paper later this year to look at this in quite a lot of detail. It's going to be peer reviewed and look exactly at the different pathways. What do they replace? There are some counterintuitive results in there, and I think it's important to take into account. And so just a heads up, this will be coming and will be, I think, important information.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for this information. We need to now to move to our next presentation. So I would like to ask Manfredi Caltagirone to speak on this international aspects. One thing that is all after the strategy is already done, IMEO is officially launched, and that is really a big event. So Commission is really pushing as much as possible, but it has also a very good partner from United Nations Environmental Program. Manfredi, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Andres and colleagues, and I'm glad to be here with you. Let me see whether I can share my screen in a way that is efficient. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we do. We do.
Fantastic. Many thanks. So I'm going to talk about the International Methane Emission Observatory. As Andres mentioned, this has been established at the beginning of March and will be helping UNEP in scaling up its activities on methane emissions, initially from the energy sector, to then be with the ambition of expanding these to other sectors of anthropogenic emission sources, such as agriculture, livestock, and waste. The starting point is that we're not on track to meet the Paris Agreement targets, that we know that CO2 actions won't be enough for reaching the those targets at the speed that the science requires us to, and that we needed to further catalyze action in a way that that would be again allowing the world to move in the right direction at the right speed. So we have established this International Methane Emission Observatory together with the European Commission. It's been recently the IMEO has also been recently endorsed by the Council of the Foreign Affairs Minister of the European Union. So it's a EU sponsored initiative that is implemented by UN Environment, and we're in discussion with a number of other governments with the hope that they will be able to join in our efforts soon. The starting point is that neither data, scientific measurements, reporting, nor regulations have shown to be able to deliver the required reductions by themselves, and certainly not at the magnitude and speed that the science requires us. And IMEO theory of change therefore consists of interconnecting all these elements. And the observatory really aims at being a hub for an ecosystem of partners and institutions that are working on methane emissions data and mitigation, at the same time adding value by catalyzing action across the value chain through its own assets, and mainly the oil and gas methane partnership that we'll talk about in a second. So the activities that the functions that the observatory will be serving is to collect confidential asset emission data through the oil and gas methane partnership, disclose aggregate company emissions, and verify progress towards announced targets. It will also integrate data on methane emissions from all available sources, correlating industry data, scientific measurements data, including sponsoring those, satellite data, and data from national inventories, so in a way that will allow for the corroboration and verification of industry reported data. And then the observatory will engage countries by developing policy relevant science, strengthening the policy science interface, and deepening the understanding of the importance of methane emissions management towards achieving the Paris Agreement goals. And finally, we will be validating the measurement methodologies and technologies so that the best available measurement systems are utilized on a wide scale. The idea of the observatory is really of a big data activist entity. It is committed to transparency, to sharing integrated data and analysis, and sponsoring policy relevant science, as we have said. But also IMEO is committed to leveraging complementary initiatives to accelerate the reduction of emission or avoiding overlap and duplication. And through its insight and its partnership with companies, governments, civil society, and scientists, it will catalyze reductions in emission globally to level and at the speed consistent with the Paris Agreement targets. So the main objective of the observatory is really to create a publicly available, empirically verified data sets of methane emissions that can catalyze action. And the way it will collect data is from one of the ways from the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. Number of partners have talked about it, but the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership has been recently relaunched in November of 2020 and is moved to what we believe is the gold standard of methane reporting currently available. It is the result of a multi-stakeholder collaboration, truly so. It is a term that is usually misused in a UN context, but in this case, we have had representatives of companies, governments, NGOs, and international organizations sitting around the table to design the principle of the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. We have expanded the partnership from only upstream to mid and downstream. We have included all sources, material sources of emissions. Companies have agreed, committed to report data not only for their operated assets, but also for their non-operated assets. And finally, companies have agreed to set targets that will be publicly disclosed by the observatory in a way that allow global stakeholders to track their progress. We have moved from an OGMP 1.0 that had seen around 12 upstream companies to a model in which we have over 70 companies representing currently 30% of oil and gas production. The companies have agreed to report their emissions according to an increasing granular and accurate set of methodologies. And as Stefan was mentioning earlier, have committed to reach gold standard, so a combination of level 4, 5 for emissions from their own operated assets, and in 5 years for non-operated assets. And in this slide, you can see how the observatory will be starting receiving data this May, so in the next few weeks, by assets that are located on 5 continents, and this will allow us to dramatically increase and the access to data, even if in a confidential manner. And this data will be then combined with data that are the result of measurement campaigns, satellite data. We have been implementing in the framework of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition a series of mid and science studies that we intend to scale up quite dramatically through the work of the observatory. And we'll be looking at better characterizing and quantifying methane emissions utilizing a variety of methods, most often a combination of top-down and bottom-up measurements, to better, again, to create data sets of data in jurisdictions that at the moment have either little data or data that are highly uncertain. This data will be then be integrated by the observatory. The observatory will be applying big data and machine learning techniques to identify gaps and reconciling consistency of the reported data by the companies, also through these corroborating the reporting that the company have provided to the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, with the result being, as I mentioned earlier, a publicly available, empirically verified data sets of methane emissions that can be then used as a basis by different stakeholders to promote actions and methane management actions in their jurisdiction. Being these governments who obviously have a responsibility in terms of ensuring the efficiency of the operations that are located in their countries, but also also companies that will be better able to prioritize action thanks to the analysis of the observatory, and stakeholders in general, NGOs, civil society, that will be able to hold accountable governments and companies towards their commitments. I'll leave it like that. This is my email, and of course, Andres, I'm very happy to respond to any questions that you might have.
Well, if we will have a time, because I would like now to give a floor to Malcolm, because today we went through MRV, LDAR, standards, international, biomethane. It's also true that I did not hear anything where Commission should not go and where it definitely should go. So it's rather balanced, I would say, approach towards the Commission, and so Commission wisdom will be needed when it will be drafting the proposal. So Malcolm, the floor is yours to make comments, and if we will have time, we will engage a bit more on international. So Malcolm, please.
Thank you, Andres, and I get to play Father Christmas and tell you that you'll all get what you want for Christmas even earlier, before the summer even. Actually, by and large, I must say most of what you said makes sense to me. I haven't heard anything that sounded ridiculously unreasonable or impossible even to implement in due course. So I thank you both, Christopher and Andres, for putting together very reasonable people to discuss this important topic together in the same room. It makes my life easier. That said, I don't know if we will be able to necessarily deliver on everything in the coming months, because after all, what we are talking about here in terms of our first and immediate priority is those legislative proposals we've been talking about since the publication of communication. Let me just go through some of the points that I heard today that I want to highlight, and some of them I'll comment on. When I don't agree, there are a few things perhaps I'm not completely in agreement with, but I'll try to make it short, although I've never been good at that. So first of all, Christopher, well, no, I should start with what you said on this. One thing you said, which I thought was it was interesting. It's not clear yet what the European Commission has in mind. Well, especially by looking at the detailed questionnaire and the open public consultation. No, I mean it is a new policy area, so I think it's fair that that we should be asking all the right questions. We're not even. I don't think we even managed to be comprehensive in our questionnaire. We managed to, I think, put all the priority questions, but we could have asked even more. And I think, well, you know, as well as I do, how important the better regulation process is. This is an opportunity to really, I think we did a good job of putting in that questionnaire our thoughts in many respects, and asking people to reflect on them, tell us, are you going in the right direction or not, and give everyone a chance to respond. But I do appreciate that it is a challenge given the detail of it and how comprehensive we try to be. Otherwise, Christopher's made some very good general points, which summarize very well the reason why we're all discussing this today. And he started with an excellent point. It's that doing something about methane is important for consumers and civil societies. The whole chain of greenhouse gases should be accounted for, and at the moment, it's very perfectly accounted for, and that's absolutely true. There's a great deal of uncertainty on methane emissions, on where they're from, on what they're coming from, what the reasons for those methane emissions are, and on their magnitude, and wide variations on that, and we need to somehow improve on that for sure. It's also, we rarely hear it, but Christopher highlighted it, and it's good to remind us from time to time that it's especially important for producers. And by that, I presume he meant especially gas producers, but not only producers of all fossil, although he did say that there are the challenges for the gas industry to consider that if they don't make good on the methane problem, eventually we'll, just like coal, we'll have to be talking about dates. I would even add dates for phase out of fossil gas. I would even add that we should have the courage to start talking about the dates of phasing out of fossil gas. But it's not something that's going to happen in the immediate, but certainly the methane challenge is one among others, by the way. But the methane challenge is one that will very much determine how much fossil gas will be part of the transition towards full decarbonization or not. And it's good to remind us of that. Then Stefan Schwartz, MRV Foundation for Effective Emission Regulation. No one could disagree with that. Absolutely. It's not for nothing that before we even thought about mitigation, we all, before I came onto the scene on methane, it was made clear that the first thing we need to work on is ensuring that we achieve robust MRV measuring, reporting, and verification. Let's not forget the verification aspect of it. Extremely important, and without that we can't do much else in terms of mitigation. Especially important in the context of methane, where the emissions are diffuse and complicated and complex along the whole supply chain. So yes, MRV is extremely important. We need to integrate methane measurement data, both top down and bottom up. Absolutely. We heard it again later on, and Freddie alluded to it, others alluded to it. It's extremely important that we use all the available technologies and evolving technologies to get the most accurate information on methane emissions as it's possible to have. Reporting based on OGMP 2.0, well, we agree with that. We made it clear in the communication. OGMP 2.0 will be criticized, no doubt, by those that fear that something that at the end of the day has been put in place by the oil and gas industry, or at least in cooperation with them, is going to serve their interests first and foremost. Well, I think you need to look at the overall, the most important aspect of what OGMP 2.0 will be delivering, and that is in fact, direct plant level measurements as much as it's possible to have them. And it's with that kind of information, I think, that we will be able to say we have robust MRV, and it's only then that we'll be able to assess the effectiveness of any kind of performance requirements that we might want to set on the industry further down the line. So that's how important the OGMP 2.0 is in terms of what it will achieve if it makes good on what it promises. And it's also the reason for why we think in the Commission that it should serve as the template, the basis for a wider inclusion of methane emissions, not just wider than oil and gas, but also other methane emissions from human activity. What the approach and the framework, the contents of the framework, and how it's done via OGMP is definitely, I think, showing the way in terms of not only how other voluntary schemes could be developed that seek to measure and report methane emissions, but also how legislation should be developed. OGMP is not necessarily perfect. Some people made it clear. Doesn't include scope 3 emissions. We need to consider that. This is why we included it in the questionnaire. Scope 3 emissions can be large. Some companies are reporting them. If they're reporting them and there are some standards in place, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Scope 3, I think is the standard that's in fact recommended by EPK to its industry. Why not look at what it does and see whether indeed in legislation we could seek to go further than Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, GMP being Scope 1 emissions. And so something to be considered. Not saying it'll be easy to develop mitigation measures when you're talking about 17% of the EU's methane emissions in the energy sector being at the level of the residential sector. Mitigation measures there. First of all, we need to have a good understanding of what's causing these methane emissions. And incredibly, today, looking at the national inventories data, we don't have that information readily available. So we're doing that analysis, trying to get a better handle of where it's coming from. And then verification should be by competent authorities, absolutely. We need to have a look at all the various competent authorities that could be involved in doing it. And getting that right will be a crucial aspect of it all. And transparency, justice transparency again, quoting from Stefan Schwartz. Independent verification and aggregated emissions data available to the public are essential. Tanya said a lot of things again that I agree with from Eldar. Thank you again for the work of the industry in providing this questionnaire on Eldar, which is at a request of the Commission to get this more detailed data. I'm glad that it's killing two birds with one stone, informing the industry about how it's being regulated in the EU, because I suspect that one could say before that questionnaire that even the industry wasn't at least comprehensively aware of how it's regulated across the EU. It goes to show there's a lot of work to do yet in understanding better not only methane emissions, but methane regulations too. And there's a recognition that LDAR programs are not harmonized. I think there are enough regulations out there and enough guidelines that exist in terms of what best practices could be in terms of LDAR for us to come up with something at the level of general principles. You asked the question, Andres, whether we should be looking at technical regulations. Certainly not what I have in mind. So I hope when I deliver the general principles, no one tells me that's not what we expected. No, but that seems evident. It's about the level of general principles, and I think on LDAR it shouldn't be too complicated, but it should go much broader, much wider than covering the gas DSOs. As you said it, Tanya, yourself, there are gas regulations on LDAR everywhere, but it's mainly at the level of the distribution network. I think it should be broader than that, and it should cover the upstream too. yes, so you made the point that there are some elements that can be identified which should form part of a robust LDAR program. We agree with that, and we're trying to identify what those elements are. Flexibility is important, recognition that one type solution does not fit all of the assets, understood, but we rely a little bit on the industry to tell us the details behind that. If you leave it to us to work it out, we might not get it right. So we need your help on that. What else did you say? Is that flexibility should be accompanied by demonstration LDAR programs are effective in reducing emissions. This requires guidelines for quantifying emissions. Perhaps. But I heard in the LDAR workshop we organized a few weeks ago that quantification by some of the people intervening, that quantification shouldn't be a key priority of LDAR campaigns. So I think it's Andres who asked a very good question. Should an LDAR campaign be able to help MRV? It is a good opportunity to include quantification. But definitely the priority of LDAR campaigns should be respected. It's about finding and repairing as a priority. If quantification means significant additional costs, especially when you're talking about measuring the largest of leaks, it's not the same as detecting. Quantification, if it means a lot more cost, then we should consider perhaps it's not necessarily as part of an LDAR campaign that you should do the quantification. And so that's something for us to reflect on, and I'm very well aware that that's one of the important issues. Then performance and procurement standards by Miriam Amani, Shell. Shell is extremely keen on performance standards. I've worked long enough in industry and lobbying for industry and being lobbied by industry to know that if industry is very keen on something, be careful. Be careful to take it up. No, I'm only half kidding. I mean, a lot of what you said made a lot of sense. We reflected that in the open public consultation. I think the priority in everyone's mind is let's get the measurement, reporting, verification right. Once we have that, it opens the door to a lot of different possibilities, among which performance requirements. Now, too often I feel when we're talking about performance requirements, we're assuming somehow that these are tailor-made for exporters, not taking into account the fact that we couldn't possibly come up with proposals that only cover exporters, that wouldn't work with the WTO, so it would be something we would have to consider doing for ourselves first. And then where I see the regulatory equivalence coming in that you mentioned as an important aspect is once we've done it for ourselves. But if we agree that robust MRV is a pre-requirement for putting performance requirements in place, and then seeking regulatory equivalence, we're talking the end of the 2020s, no doubt. So it won't come quickly enough. I'm not saying that that's an argument for trying to put in place performance requirements now on the basis of, as we made it clear, completely imperfect data. But we should be careful about when it will be able to help us. And also let's consider right now. Let's not just write policy papers talking about how good performance requirements would be to get exporters to reduce their methane emissions on the basis that we're the biggest exporters of natural gas, and therefore we have the power to do that. Let's talk about the political implications of this. Some of you here are old enough to have experienced, and Christopher Jones will know about this, the time when Commissioner Edegaard had the intention of putting in place on CO2 intensity default values on crude oils being imported into the EU. DG Klima was behind that initiative. And it's something worth reflecting on. Who else is doing this in the world right now, I ask you? We would be pioneers in regulating others or trying to regulate others, whichever way we would seek to do it, with procurement requirements or performance targets. It's no mean feat. If we manage to make the political case, that's one aspect. And then we're not even beginning to talk about the technical. And I could talk, I think, for a long time about all the technical issues with such a type of regulation, and the legal ones, of course, which some of you have alluded to. But then if I was to try to perhaps develop something on the basis of what exists, and it's true, you've highlighted the fact that you have currently performance requirements on the basis of intensity, which a lot of companies have signed up to. I would say we would, in order to try to see where we could get to with that, we would have to have perfect transparency in terms of whether or not there's any fudging behind these numbers. And at the moment, we're having to just trust the industry that, you know, what they're saying there, that their methane emission intensity is correct. We have no means of checking that. So at the moment, it's purely a marketing gimmick, and no one is able to say, yeah, they're really meeting their engagements in a way which we can verify through third parties. So is that a good model for us to follow and put into legislation? I wonder. Others will tell us, and we'll have to take into account the views of the public on this and others. But I'm not completely convinced, but absolutely convinced, however, that performance requirements as well as prescriptive requirements have a part to play in combination, perhaps, and we should consider what part they could play. And then the third-party verification is something that I always feel a bit nervous about. I was not so long ago working in the realm of, you know, guarantees of origins and sustainability certificates of the Renewable Energy Directive. Let's see what we've managed to do on that front, and see what can be copied from that to try to regulate the fossil industry. Let's make sure, though, that if we do it, there's no greenwashing, and also that we're not completely delegating to private entities to verify and certify. That, you know, EU member states should have skin in that game, I feel like. So perhaps I'm expressing more my views there than an official Commission view. But and then moving to biogas and biomethane, Nicholas Jensen gave us a masterclass on anaerobic digesters. Thank you very much, Nicholas. I'm forgetting about all these things. It's good to have a reminder. Yes, agriculture, waste sector methane emissions, hard to abate. Yes, biogas, biomethane is a solution. I mean, in the communication, we recognize that. How could biogas, biomethane be further incentivized? You made a recognition of all the existing legislation. Certainly the Renewable Energy Directive being the most important one in terms of how it's incentivized. I didn't hear proposals, explicit proposals on that, but I'm supposing that the industry is responding to the consultation, has responded to the consultation on the revision of the RED to take the opportunity of perhaps beefing up support for sustainable, truly sustainable waste and residue-based biogas and biomethane. I think that's the main way forward, and I think as a result also that it's the main way forward probably to regulate methane emissions in the biogas biomethane sector, simply because it already does that. The default values already take into account leakages in biogas biomethane plants. My feelings, though, is that they're probably outdated. They're probably not conservative enough. The whole point of default values is they should be conservative. And also, we haven't provided the opportunity to the industry yet to deliver actual values to demonstrate that they're doing better than default values. So my view is that we should use the Renewable Energy Directive to tackle methane leakages in biogas, biomethane processing, which can be large. Some of the studies I've come across are quite alarming in how much leakage there can be in the biogas, biomethane process. So we should worry about it, and we should consider first and foremost RED, not ruling out necessarily any room for biogas, biomethane in the upcoming methane regulations, as Nicholas said. And I look forward to your views on that, because I think you're probably right. Certainly not everything that's relevant to the gas value chain, the fossil gas value chain, is relevant to biogas, biomethane. On what Manfredi said, last but not least, Manfredi on the IMEO, OGMP, well, we're very supportive of all this. Manfredi made it clear the Commission is firmly behind all these initiatives. If we've signed up to putting OGMP into legislation, as I said earlier on, is because we believe in it. And yes, I like the fact, I like what you're saying, the IMEO, it's, you know, methane is a global problem. It requires a global solution. And I think the most effective way to take into account anything we're talking about, the likeliness of trying to, you know, via regulatory equivalence to get prescriptive requirements, obligations on exporters or performance requirements on exporters. I think the most likely way that for us to progress in the future with regards to further abating methane emissions linked to fossil fuel consumption in the EU, but not just emissions occurring within the EU's territory. I think the IMEO is probably, you know, the way it will show us the way forward and represents the, in my view, at least the biggest chance that we have. So we have to be very talented diplomats in the near future to get other countries to sign up to it and to put their money where their mouth is. I always intend to make it clear, by the way, when we talk about IMEO and OGMP, because OGMP has foreseen a role for IMEO in terms of verification, although I feel perhaps not yet in a very detailed and clear enough way, is that IMEO should seek to collect emissions data through OGMP and verify it, yes, but not only. Should be really the source that will collect all methane emissions, eventually broader than the energy sector also, and verify it. And it should be absolutely from bottom up and top down sources, and it should be completely independent from any industry initiative. So the IMEO is there to verify the OGMP, but it's not part of OGMP. Let's be clear; it's a very separate entity. It's independent. It's government funded only. And that's extremely important to highlight that. And you said, Manfredi, that eventually the aim of what the IMEO will do in terms of data is to produce a full methane emissions data set. And it could be the basis for a lot of different things, such as the most evident being an international market transparency tool based on all the different methane emissions data, open and accessible by all who want to have information on the gas they're buying. We can dream of the world when we'll be able to just look up this website, the IMEO, and say, well, that gas from that particular basin being sold by, even better, being sold by that particular company is not the kind of gas we want to be importing into the EU if we're serious about achieving our decarbonization objectives by 2050. Let's all dream. Let's all pause for a minute and dream that we arrive at such a day at some point in the future, sooner rather than later. I'll end it there, but very worthwhile comments from all. Thank you very much for inviting me to conclude. I've never been good at doing this before, but I was paying real attention today, so I think I, even if I say so myself, managed to probably highlight most of the most important points. If not, forgive me, I did my best. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Malcolm, for generous comments. And I think it was really a great event. I would like again to thank the speakers. I hope that everybody benefited from this event because it is a new area. It is really challenging area. And we wish also European Commission really to design the wisest proposal from the all wise options that we have. Thank you very much. Thank you from me and thank you from Christopher Jones. And see you next time.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.